So I'm Jim Hollifield. I'm a professor here at SMU and the director of the Tower Center. And I know we've got a lot of fantastic guests coming from out of town who maybe their first trip here to the Tower Center to SMU. But for those of you who are making a little excursion outside the Beltway, we want to welcome here to Dallas Fort Worth, which is really the heartland where the action is. Hopefully you'll be able to stick around long enough to get a real non-DC experience of what life is like out here in Texas. The Tower Center itself, and most of you know this, we cover an enormous territory, both literally and figuratively. We are a center for public and international affairs, public policy and international affairs. We're also, as many of you know, to the extent that SMU has an area studies, regional studies center, we do that. Last week we did Japan. This week we're doing the Middle East, and we'll be going back to Mexico pretty soon. We have a sister center on Texas and Mexico. But I'm especially proud of this program, this project, because of the colleagues here who have stepped up and taken a leadership role in this. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize them right off the bat, because they are the ones who put this together and made it happen, beginning with my colleague, and hold your applause, please. We'll do that at the end. But my colleague, Ray Rafiti, with whom I've worked for quite some time now, and who has a background in Middle East studies. He's also the associate director of the Tower Center, our financial officer. If you're ever waiting on a check from the Tower Center, you'll know who to talk to here. He's the guy, and he makes it happen. I mean, people do get paid, and they get paid on time. So that's a fantastic talent to have. Also, my colleague Sabri, who's sitting over here at the other head table. Sabri, who is a professor of history here and an expert on Middle East history. I think he did some work in Iran at one point, Iraq. He's originally from Turkey. So he knows the region well, and I hope you'll have a chance to interact and talk with him. We should also give him some condolences because he's the chair of the history department. Being the chair of an academic department is not an easy job, as many of you know. And finally, I want to recognize Ambassador Robert Jordan, who's here. Again, we'll applaud everybody at the end, but Bob especially gets thanks for his leadership in the center. He is our diplomat in residence. And if you haven't had a chance to look at his short bio, I encourage you to do that. I know he took up his post as ambassador to Saudi about a month after the 9/11 attacks, and I think for the first month or two he was in Saudi Arabia. He had to sleep in a different place every night, so make sure that he didn't get assassinated there. So he's been out there on the front lines and has worked hard. Also a partner at Baker Botts and ran the Baker Botts operation in the Middle East. I also have to take just a moment to thank all of you who are supporters of the Tower Center. We have several board members here. I want to quickly recognize them, beginning with Jean Cox, who's sitting here, Jean Tower Cox. She and I have been at this for quite a number of years now, and I think the Tower Center has grown beyond anything that we could have imagined when we started out on this project. And Bob Jordan, also a board member, vice chair of the board, and Kathy Cooper over here. Many of you know Dr. Kathleen Cooper, who's not only a board member but also a fellow in the center, teaches occasionally when we can get her to do that. And again, I encourage you to meet them. I also want to thank all of the people in the audience who are members of the Tower Center Forum, who support us with annual gifts. They help make all of these things possible. Our faculty, our students, and again, a special word of welcome to those who are coming to join us today for this program. I spent about 25 years of my life as a fellow at the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Many of you know the Wilson Center sadly It has been closed by the current administration, but it was one of my great privileges to work there. And I want to give a special note of thanks to Marissa Kurma, who's here, who had come in to direct the Middle East program. I know she worked very closely with Ray. How many times we have been up to the Wilson Center. I've many projects there over the years. One of the great international centers in the world, brought scholars from all over the planet to Washington, D.C. And I'll just conclude by saying the Middle East. I started my career studying the Middle East. I even started trying to learn Arabic, and I was a student in France when I was doing this, so I see the Middle East very much through a French lens, even to this day. But it was tough. It was 1975. The Lebanese Civil War had just started. I was in a seminar with Palestinians and Israelis in the same class, and that was a huge lesson for me beginning in my career. And after a year or two of this, I just said, I don't think I can spend my life studying the Middle East. It's just too depressing, too difficult. And I shifted to study Europe. But guess what? If you become an expert on Europe, you teach Europe and do research there, you can't do it without studying the Middle East and Africa. They are very much joined at the hip. So those are just a few words of introduction from me, Ray and Sabri. I think we're going to get the program started here in a minute. So I think it's Sabri who's going to come up and introduce the panels, the speakers. So let's just give everybody applause.
Thank you, Dr. Hollyfield, and I want to welcome everybody as well, too. We're glad that you're here, and we're going to have a wonderful program today. I'll keep it very brief. I just want to introduce Sabri to those who don't know him, which aren't many people here. What?
He did already.
He did. Okay. All right. Well, then that's fine. Come on up, and I'll let you introduce Robin Wright, who's our distinguished speaker today. So thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everybody. And I'm introducing one of our speakers, but we have many really wonderful speakers, and thank you all for being here. And but I'm especially honored to, of course, introduce our keynote speaker, Robin Wright. Now, to give a full account of her extraordinary and distinguished career will require a keynote address of its own. And I'm not going to do that. But what follows is, therefore, a very brief summary. Robin Wright, should I say, was a USIP and Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow and one of the nation's leading authorities on the Middle East, Iran, and the political and military dynamics of the Muslim world. A contributing writer and columnist for The New Yorker since 1988, she has built a remarkable career reporting from more than 140. And let me repeat, if anybody missed that, 140 countries across 6 continents, covering dozen wars and revolutions. Wright has been a correspondent for the Washington Post, CBS News, Los Angeles Times, and the Sunday Times of London. Her first piece for The New Yorker on Iran won the National Magazine Award for Best Reporting. Over the course of her career, she had received numerous prestigious honors, including the UN Correspondents Association Gold Medal for international coverage, the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Reporting in any medium requiring exceptional courage and initiative, and a little bit of madness, I will say, for her coverage of wars in Africa, this was, and the National Press Club Award for Diplomatic Reporting. And she was also recognized get a recognition from the American Academy of Diplomacy as the Journalist of the Year. She is also a recipient of MacArthur Foundation grant. In addition to her journalism, she has also been a fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the leading universities including Yale, Duke, Dartmouth, and the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the author and editor of several influential books, including The Last Great Revolution, Turmoil and Transformation in Iran, Sacred Rage, The Wrath of Militant Islam, Dreams and Shadows, The Future of the Middle East, selected by New York Times and Washington Post as one of the most notable books of 2008. Her Rock the Kasbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World was named the best book on international affairs by Overseas Press Club. Last but not least, she is also the editor of Iran Premier, Power, Politics, and U.S. Policy that I use in my classes when I teach on Iran. She's also a frequent television analyst on major news networks and Wright's decades of journalism, scholarship, and policy analysis have established her as one of the most authoritative and insightful voices on international affairs and the Middle East. And we are very happy that she is here. Please help me welcoming here. Hello, everybody. And I am asked to introduce our moderator. We have a wonderful panel in front of us now. Ambassador Jordan is going to moderate, and we will follow the same kind of rules. He will have his questions and then open up to audience questions. We were supposed to actually in this panel have another ambassador, David Hale, Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow of Middle East Institute, but unfortunately he is sick and he couldn't make it. And let me introduce our moderator, Ambassador Jordan. He is also a diplomat in residence in Tower Center and also, of course, teaches wonderful classes for our political science department. And I benefited from his expertise over the years, and students are very lucky to have him. Robert Jordan is a diplomat in residence, as I mentioned, and professor of practice at SMU's Tower Center for Political Studies. And he formerly, as you heard, served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2001 to 2003, where he helped strengthen Saudi cooperation on counterterrorism and reform following the September 11 attacks. So it's not MBS, it's Ambassador Jordan. Before retiring in 2014, he was a partner at Baker Botts LLP and led the firm's Middle Eastern practice in Dubai. He currently serves in leadership and advisory roles with several major organizations, of course, including the Tower Center, the Middle East Institute in DC, and bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce. He's also a member of Council on Foreign Relations, and he is a published author and frequent commentator on international affairs for major media outlets such as CNN, Bloomberg, the New York Times, and of course, Dallas News, right? He also writes, how often do you write for that?
About twice a month.
Twice a month,
Yeah.
all right. So I am very pleased to invite him here or Derek to start the panel.
All right. Thank you very much. And it's good to be with you all again. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel. First is Dr. Amy Austin-Holmes. She is a clear expert on the Middle East. She serves on the faculty of the Bush School of Government and Public Service in their Washington, D.C. operation, which some of you may not know about, but it's a fabulous program they have developed there. She has a PhD from Johns Hopkins. She's authored several books on regional politics, including works on Syria and Egypt, published by Oxford University Press. She has had academic and research positions at the American University in Cairo, where one of my sons studied for a while, Harvard, George Washington University, and has been a public service advisor to the U.S. Department of State. She's worked on track 2 diplomacy, and we might want to talk about that at some point here because I think that's something that doesn't get enough attention as well, and has testified before the U.S. Commission on International Freedom, Religious Freedom. It's also my pleasure to introduce Giorgio Cafiero. Giorgio is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown and an adjunct fellow at the American Security Project. He frequently contributes to Al Jazeera, Gulf International Forum, the New Arab, Responsible Statecraft, the Stimson Center, and Amwaj Media. He has consulted with many public and private sector entities. He has briefed diplomats in many countries, and he has worked as a subject matter expert for multinational law firms. He has an MA in International Relations from the University of San Diego. So I would like, Amy, for you to go ahead and start first talking about your great in-depth work regarding Syria, and then we'll turn to Giorgio, and I don't think we're going to run out of material over the next hour or so.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Jordan, and thank you to everyone at the Tower Center for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here on your beautiful campus at SMU and to be part of this very important symposium. So thank you to everyone for making this possible. So as Ambassador Jordan mentioned, I'm going to focus my remarks on Syria. I'd be happy to talk about some of the other countries in the region. I did teach at the American University in Cairo before, during, and after what was known as the Arab Spring, the overthrow of the Mubarak dictatorship after 30 years. So I do also have some thoughts on that, but I'm going to focus my comments on Syria because a lot has been happening there over the past year, especially since the fall of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, as I'm sure everyone here in the room knows. After more than half a century of rule by the same family, the Bashar al-Assad inherited the power essentially from his father, Hafez al-Assad. So now, after more than half a century of rule by one of the most brutal dictatorships, arguably not just in the Middle East, but anywhere in the world, Syria has the chance to transition to something better. And the question is, will that happen? And what could we potentially do to help make sure that Syrians have a better future? So I put a map up here of Syria as a result of the past 15 years, beginning in the 2011 when the conflict began in Syria. The country became fragmented into really, depending on how you count them, 4 or 5 different regions of control. The map shows this was actually a map, Pentagon map that was put out last year. So after the fall of the regime, but it shows that the country, even after Assad fell and the new government took over, that the country remained fragmented into the parts controlled in the west by the interim government in Damascus, Turkish-occupied parts in the north. Turkey controlled about almost 10% of Syria through multiple cross-border interventions, which still doesn't receive as much attention as I think it should, because Turkey has played a very, a major role in shaping the trajectory of events in Syria. So you have that Turkish-occupied part in the north. This is somewhat changing now, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. And then you have the Al-Tanf base down there in the south, where you have the American flag. That was just handed over a few days ago to the new government in Damascus, the interim government in Damascus. And then the northeast, which is where I had done my research over the past decade, starting in 2015, which became known as the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. Sometimes in Arabic, that's how it's known. Kurds sometimes call it Rojava, Western Kurdistan. But it is now that this map has again changed after the offensive that was launched by Ahmed al-Shara, interim government in Damascus, against the Kurds, which I'll talk about as well. But in any case, the country has been fragmented into these different regions of control. Now, this is a picture from Kobane in 2015. That's the Kurdish city directly on the border to Turkey, but in Syria. And does anybody know why Kobane is significant? So that's the city really where the U.S. partnership with the Syrian Kurds began. That was the beginning of the end of the Islamic State. That is the first time in Syria that the Islamic State, which Robin did a fantastic job talking about their extreme brutality, including enslavement of Yazidis, Christians and others, the genocide that has been recognized as a genocide that they committed against Yazidis in Sinjar, Iraq, just across the border in Iraq. They then, of course, also continued this rampage of terror into Syria. And the first town inside Syria that dealt them a defeat was this small Kurdish city of Kobane. And that's where the United States began to partner with the Kurds. At the time, they were still known as the YPG, YPJ. They then became the Syrian Democratic Forces, and so I'll just refer to them as the SDF from now on. But they're Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. So I started a survey of the SDF back in 2015, but I'm not going to talk about that. So happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you like. But I'm going to just go now to the period since the fall of the regime, okay? So it's important to point out that HTS, which is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, where al-Shara he comes from, was only one of 4 rebel groups that ousted the Assad regime, actually. People maybe forget that, or it hasn't been highlighted because al-Shara has consolidated power, but actually there were 4 separate rebel groups that were all marching on Damascus. In fact, the Southern Operations Room, this is a member of that rebel group that I interviewed in Dada after the fall of the regime. They were actually in Damascus before HTS, right? So they were actually there first. Then for various reasons, they decided to withdraw. But you have a variety of rebel groups that sort of led to the toppling of this regime, including also some of the Turkish-backed groups. The Syrian National Army and the Kurdish-led SDF had evicted the regime from some of the points in the northeast. So the question that has been sort of the big question over the past year is, okay, is HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, former Al-Qaeda, are they really reformed now? Ahmed al-Shara was known as Jolani when he was in HTS or Al-Qaeda. And the question is he still a jihadist or is he now a pragmatist? Is he reformed? In July 2016, Jolani split from Al-Qaeda and formed HTS. But HTS was, as I'm sure you all know, designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the United Nations, the UN, and other countries. But on July 8 of 2025, last year, the United States decided to revoke that FTO designation. So the transition period, I think again, a lot has happened, but I just want to highlight a few things. A year ago, in February of 2025, Ahmed al-Shara convened a so-called national dialogue. Now, when other countries around the world have gone through major transitions, for example, South Africa after the fall of apartheid, or Colombia with the peace process with the FARC, different types of transitions, different countries, different circumstances, but they often need to convene a national dialogue to bring people together. And in other countries, these dialogues can last for months, sometimes years, because there's a lot to discuss, right? About transitional justice. How are you going to form a new government? What is a new system you're going to set up? How long did this national dialogue last in Syria? 1 day. 1 day. And if you can call it a dialogue, which I think that was a fake dialogue. A lot of the people and nobody from the Northeast, that again, they controlled like a third of the country, the Kurdish-led autonomous region in the Northeast, none of them were invited. Many people got invitations like a few hours or a day before the dialogue took place. And as you know, Syrian diaspora live all over the world. So they couldn't even get there on time. So clearly this dialogue was more of a charade. It was not a real dialogue. There's a provisional constitution, largely concentrates power in the presidency. It lacks institutional checks and balances. The government formation, technocratic in appearance, but in reality, it's dominated by HTS. Very little inclusion of women, minorities. There's one single woman in the cabinet, Hint Kabawat. She's also the only Christian in the cabinet. And then the transitional justice sort of process is also very exclusionary. And until now, they focused mainly on crimes committed by the Assad regime, not any of the crimes committed by the Islamic State. In the Northeast, in the Kurdish autonomous region in the Northeast, they created their own judicial system as part of this local government governance structures that they created in the Northeast, and they have tried ISIS crimes in the Northeast. So that's just one of the various differences between the Northeast and Damascus. January 2025, so about a month after the fall of the regime, some changes to the school curriculum were announced by, at the time, the Minister of Education. They removed any references to these injustices of the Ottomans, and they included references to Jews and Christians as those who'd gone astray from the true path in the curriculum that they're going to be teaching to students in Syria. Now, supposedly that's again been reformed, but these are some of the early signs that, question, are they really reformed, or are they still going to be sort of preaching some kind of very extreme interpretation of Islam, or including that in the curriculum? Most worrying, however, perhaps, have been the series of sectarian massacres or targeted killings of various ethnic and religious groups in Syria. The Alawites were the first group that was targeted in March of last year. A Reuters investigation found that the chain of command led to Damascus. Over 1,500 Alawites were massacred. Now, one could think that this was perhaps a time of was chaos. Al-Shaddad hadn't yet was trying to form his new military, but it was still, again, not fully consolidated. There were different armed groups that weren't really under his control. So maybe, one could think that he didn't really fully, oversee this. But again, the Reuters investigation found that the chain of command did lead to Damascus. So some of this was actually being encouraged by the government in Damascus or tolerated. But then more worrying is that this sort of playbook was just repeated a few months later against the Druze minority in Sueda in July. There was also some targeting of Druze in April near Damascus and Jadamana. About 25 or over 25 Christians were killed at a suicide attack at the Mar Elias church in Damascus in the summer. And then again in July, this big assault by Damascus against the Druze in Sueda in the south, under the guise of trying to consolidate territory, is how they justified this incursion into Sueda. They were expelled, and so Sueda is still not under the control of Damascus. So the SDF, however, despite having reason to be distrustful of Damascus, they were under a lot of American pressure to make an agreement with Damascus, so they signed this March 10 agreement, 2025, which I'll come back and talk about maybe a little bit later, because that agreement has now been sort of overturned, and there's a new agreement that was just signed this past January 30. But just a couple points I wanted to make about how we have essentially these two different governance structures, the one in Damascus, led by Ahmed al-Shaddad, and then the one in the Northeast that has been, for the past 12 years or so, a semi-autonomous region led by Kurds. And what I did in a report that I published actually with the Mosbacher Institute, which is part of Texas A&M University, is to compare the governance structures in the Northeast and in Damascus, and to ask to what extent do they live up to what are kind of understood to be the best practices for what should happen in a post-conflict situation. Like what ideally would a country do if you want to transition away from conflict to a peaceful, stable, more inclusive government? Now, an overwhelming body of literature shows that including women in governance advances national security, improves service provision for all communities, and it can even prevent conflict relapse. This is a graph from the Council on Foreign Relations. As a result of this, many countries around the world have actually adopted what they call national action plans on women. Just a few more sort of data points on this comparison that I was making, because it's also important in terms of the economic situation in Syria, which is very dire. Over 90% of the population live under the poverty line. The World Bank estimates, however, that if women's participation in the economy in Syria would match that of men, currently it's only about 13% of Syrian women are in the labor force compared to about 62% of men. But if they would increase women's labor force participation in Syria, this could lead to an increase in the long-run GDP per capita of up to 74%. So surely you would think that if Damascus understands their country is in a terrible economic crisis, they should be trying to encourage women to join the labor force. But instead, they're some officials are doing the opposite. They're discouraging women from working outside the home. They're discouraging women from doing certain things, saying it's not suitable for their economic, for their nature, etc. So this is again World Bank data. On governance structures, the 30% threshold in Parliament that is the ideal threshold you would meet, that has been shown to prevent conflict, relapse in other countries around the world. In the so-called elections that were not really elections, more like a selection process that engineered by Damascus, the parliamentary elections resulted in only 4% women representation in the parliament, which is less than under the Assad regime, where they had 10% women in the parliament. In the Northeast, they have tried to increase women's participation in their local economy across all various sectors, including in local councils. So these are the parts of Syria that were excluded from those parliamentary elections in October. Language rights. The UN says that actually allowing mother tongue education is more cost effective. It reduces dropout rates, results in better academic results, and that it improves literacy in both the mother tongue and the official language. Now, in the Northeast, they've introduced a curriculum where Kurdish and Aramaic, the language spoken by the Assyrian Christian minority that is the language spoken by Jesus, is taught in schools. They have a curriculum that is promoting these languages. Whereas in the north, in Damascus, they had not recognized Kurdish as an official language. That now has changed just a few weeks ago with a presidential decree by Ahmed Ashara. The concern is because that's a decree, a presidential decree, it could be revoked. So they're advocating for this to be in the Constitution. So again, these are the different approaches between the Damascus and the Northeast. And finally, in terms of peace negotiations or any negotiations, having more women involved in these negotiations has been shown to be more effective. It means that the agreements are more likely to last up to 15 years, 35% more likely to last up to 15 years. So as part of these negotiations between Damascus and the Northeast, you had, delegations, and you can see in this picture, the delegation from the Northeast is on your left. You see women and men, it's half women, half men, and on the right, the delegation from Damascus, there were no women. So this is just a brief snapshot of how different these sort of governance structures are, and that we have to, I think, keep in mind that there is an alternative governance structure in Syria. And what is key now is how will they sort of negotiate and how will they potentially integrate? But I'll maybe leave it at that. And happy to talk about more of this in the Q&A and my most recent article about this topic for also more background information. So thank you.
Great. All right, and Giorgio, we'll turn to you next, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. I want to thank everyone at SMU who made this possible. I want to talk about the tensions that are taking place between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Definitely, these sets of tensions are making many headlines right now, and I'm going to try to sort of explain what sits at the root, what the root causes are of the friction between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and sort of the implications for the region. I think a good place to begin is with the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. Those revolutions and mass protests all over the Arab world terrified the leadership in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Many concerns in those capitals that the revolutions would be contagious, spread to more countries in the region, and ultimately come into the GCC, which actually did happen to a limited extent. And that really led to Saudi Arabia and the UAE coming together in what I would call a counter-revolutionary axis. And we saw this immediately in 2011 when the Arab Spring uprising took place in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Emirati police and Saudi military personnel went into the archipelago kingdom to put down the uprising. In 2013, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were very much responsible for what took place with the military takeover and the ouster of Egypt's president, Mohamed Morsi. The two Gulf states made it very clear to the Egyptian military that if they would remove Morsi from power. They would ensure that the new authorities in Cairo would have all the financial support they needed for the economy to stabilize. In 2017, these two countries really led the blockade of Qatar, which again entailed Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt cutting off diplomatic and economic relations with Doha and imposing a blockade on the country. Again, the view was that Qatar had been friendly to the revolutionary movements and had a Muslim Brotherhood friendly foreign policy, and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, viewing the Arab Spring revolutions and the role of Islamists in those revolutions, believed it was unacceptable for a GCC member to side with these revolutionary forces. And again, very much on the same page in terms of countering the influences of Qatar, Iran, Turkey, and the Muslim Brotherhood. I think probably there was no sign of alignment between these two Gulf monarchies as much as what took place in March 2015, when they were both part of an Arab-led military coalition that went into Yemen to fight the Houthi rebellion. From Riyadh and Abu Dhabi's perspective, the Houthi rebellion represented an extension of Iran's destabilizing influence in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and they were the two dominant actors in this Arab military coalition trying to reverse the Houthi takeover of Sana'a and other parts of Yemen. It should also be noted that there was an important relationship between Mohammed bin Salman, now Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Zayed, now the President of the UAE, bringing us back to 2015 when MBS was ascending. It was really Mohammed bin Zayed who reached out to the Obama administration and basically said, Mohammed bin Salman is the right man for Saudi Arabia. He can think outside the box, and it would be very good for the Gulf and the whole Middle East, as well as the United States, to have a young Saudi like Mohammed bin Salman at the helm. Then after the October 2008 murder of Jamal Khashoggi, it was Emirati diplomats and officials who lobbied the first Trump White House and the Congress to not move ahead with sanctions on the Saudi leadership. So the point is, really from about 2011 up until the mid to late 2010s, these two countries were extremely aligned. What became very clear, though, is that despite overlapping interests on the part of Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, their strategies, their tactics, and perspectives really began to diverge, and this was very visible in Yemen. The Saudi-led military campaign was facing many problems in the fight against the Houthis. It became a very disastrous campaign, and the UAE decided to really shift its priorities in Yemen. This makes sense because the part of Yemen the Houthis control is on the border of Saudi Arabia. The UAE, which does not have a border with Yemen, was perceiving threats very differently, which is totally rational given that its national interests are not the same as any other countries. But at that point, the UAE began to really focus on its interests in southern Yemen, interests in backing anti-Muslim Brotherhood groups in the south, and trying to use these groups, maybe we can say as proxies or surrogates, to enhance the UAE's clout in southern Yemen. This was about interests on the UAE's part that go way beyond Yemen, really about what I would consider a maritime empire that Abu Dhabi seeks to run through the Gulf of Aden, the Bab al-Mandab, the Red Sea, and into the Mediterranean. And the UAE asserts a lot of its influence through directly or indirectly controlling key ports that are situated on these important trade corridors that go through these bodies of water. And in the process, the UAE was backing southern separatists in Yemen who have been dreaming of reestablishing the state of southern Yemen that existed from 1967 to 1990. I think this was the biggest source of contention between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in the late 2010s. Saudi Arabia, very focused on north-south unity in Yemen, had interests that were completely incompatible with those of the groups that the UAE was backing. And we saw at certain times that Saudi-aligned factions in Yemen were fighting the STC, which was formally established in 2017. But during those episodes, there was always success in terms of kind of cooling the tensions, dealing with the friction behind closed doors. And we saw, for example, the 2019 Riyadh agreement that to an extent did quite a good job at sort of putting a lid on the tensions, not resolving the core issues, but just preventing these tensions from getting out of control. Then by the early 2020s, we also saw some friction between Saudi Arabia and the UAE over the Qatar blockade. It should be noted that when it began in mid-2017, the UAE was the main agent. It was really Mohammed bin Zayed who had this design on blockading Qatar, and I think Saudi Arabia sort of went along with it. By about 2020, Saudi Arabia said, look, this blockade has been quite pointless. It's time to swallow some pride, lift the blockade, and reconcile with Doha. The leadership in Abu Dhabi did not like that at all, and they felt that Saudi Arabia had sort of undermined the effort to pressure Qatar by moving toward reconciliation. And we saw in 2021, January 2021, the Al-Ula Accord went into effect, the blockade got lifted, and Abu Dhabi was somewhat resentful of Saudi Arabia for driving the reconciliation process. There were also issues in OPEC Plus, where the Saudis wanted to extend production cuts. The UAE did not like that, so certainly some competition within OPEC. What we have seen really throughout the 2020s, which I think is important to emphasize, is a change in Saudi Arabia's foreign policy. During Mohammed bin Salman's first years ascending to power, he was behind many aggressive foreign policy moves, blockade of Qatar, war in Yemen, the issue with the Lebanese prime minister being detained in the kingdom, definitely lobbying the Trump administration to impose maximum pressure on Iran, a lot of rhetoric. It was very aggressive toward Iran. But I think Mohammed bin Salman started to realize that Vision 2030, which is the kingdom's grandiose economic diversification and development agenda aimed at ending Saudi Arabia's economic dependence on oil by the end of this decade, is the most important priority for Saudi Arabia. And to make Vision 2030 successful, the kingdom has to lure massive amounts of foreign direct investment into the kingdom to grow sectors like entertainment, tourism, logistics. And I think to Mohammed bin Salman's credit, I think he matured a lot after the initial 5 years of ascending to power and realized that Vision 2030's success will depend on stability at home in Saudi Arabia and throughout the neighborhood. And we saw in 2022, Saudi Arabia entered a de facto truce with the Houthis. It was understood that it's tough to get foreign companies to come into Saudi Arabia and invest billions when you have Houthi drones and missiles flying into the kingdom. There was, of course, the reconciliation agreement with Iran in March 2023, the reconciliation with Qatar, the reconciliation with the former Syrian government in May of 2023. And in line with this vision for stability, Saudi Arabia's leadership believes that there should be a regional order in which international borders are recognized and respected, where state sovereignty is respected, and where the authority of central governments is recognized and respected. This is a vision that is completely at odds with UAE's foreign policy strategy, which advances Abu Dhabi's interests through supporting sub-state and non-state actors that undermine the sovereignty of national institutions in fragile countries. We saw this again with STC in Yemen, the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, the self-declared breakaway Republic of Somaliland in Somalia. And Saudi Arabia believes that the UAE's support for these sub-state actors is undermining stability at a time when Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 really needs that stability. Just to very quickly go into what happened in Yemen late last year that brought these tensions between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to a very high level. The STC, which was, of course, again, the de facto authorities in southern Yemen, waged military operations that greatly expanded the amount of Yemeni land that they controlled, bringing them all the way up to the Saudi border in eastern Yemen, also as far out to the Omani border in eastern Yemen. And the Saudi perspective was that this was extremely dangerous to the security of the kingdom. And given that the STC launched that operation the same day as the GCC summit, the Saudis were particularly angry at Abu Dhabi, believing that the STC could have only made this move with the green light from the UAE. So the Saudis made it very clear that the STC, and by extension the UAE, had crossed a red line. And then at the way end of December, the Saudis intervened militarily to bomb transfer of arms from the UAE to the STC at the port of Mukalla. I think it's sort of fair to say that even though this took place in Yemen, many people interpret this as one GCC state directly striking another. And the rhetoric that came from Saudi Arabia was very fierce, very harsh. So this marked an end of a period of the two countries dealing with their problems behind closed doors. The tensions became much more overt and out in the open. I think from the UAE's perspective, one of the reasons why it wants to back these sub-state actors like the STC or the RSF is to try to counter the Muslim Brotherhood. And these groups that the UAE supports are very anti-Islamist, very anti-Muslim Brotherhood. So the UAE's view is that that is a way to promote stability. Saudi Arabia, certainly not a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, I think believes it needs to be more pragmatic in how it deals with the Muslim Brotherhood. And when offshoots of the Islamist movement have parties in power in some of these national governments, they believe it's important to still work with those governments in order to prevent fragmentation of states. And I'll sort of wrap this up by saying, in kind of a grander geopolitical context, we see a tremendous amount of alignment between the UAE and Israel right now. And Israel is also supporting forces of fragmentation in the Middle East. And after September 9th of last year, when the Israelis bombed Doha, the Saudis and others in the GCC, probably with the exception of the UAE, have a much higher threat perception of Israel, believing that Israel is a direct threat to the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf. And therefore, the alignment between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv is one that increasingly unsettles Saudi Arabia. And right now, the Saudis are trying to shore up support and create some alignment with other countries that similarly view Emirati-Israeli alignment as dangerous. This includes Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. I don't see these countries forming a bloc that is anti-UAE, but I do think that they're going to come together and be on the same page in terms of opposing fragmentation in the region, because they see fragmentation as very dangerous, especially in extremely fragile countries. Just very quickly to bring this back to the United States here, I think these tensions between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE could pose a major challenge to U.S. interests, and the Trump administration will have to navigate this carefully. I think it's clear that the United States never likes it when our friends and allies in the Gulf are not getting along. The blockade of Qatar was a huge, huge headache for the United States. And I think probably the Trump administration is not going to have much success in terms of addressing the root causes of this friction between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But the Trump administration will probably be able to use its close ties with both Abu Dhabi and Riyadh to convince them to not escalate further. And again, I think the tension will stay between UAE and Saudi Arabia. I'm not optimistic about any grand reconciliation between them, but I think it would be a success for the Trump administration if they could play their cards in a manner that prevent this tension between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh from escalating into something similar to what we saw in 2017 with Qatar. So I hope we can have a chance to build on this a bit later, but I want to leave my remarks there for right now.
I'll have a few questions. I saw a hand back there. Would it be okay if we wait for the question period, or? Sure. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
It would probably be helpful for many, if not most of us, if we were hearing full names of entities rather than abbreviations like GCC. Oh, I'm so sorry.
SPC.
Yeah, yes, yeah, I know, but we're hearing that now and we didn't know,
Mhm.
all this presentation. So it would be so helpful if full names were provided to us because we're not all scholars here. Thank you.
Well, let me start with SMU. Many thanks to both of you. I'll start with. Your mic is not on. Oh. There we go. I got carried away. The story of Ahmad al-Shara, or Jelani, as he previously was called in his nom de guerre, I guess, is one that is it's hard to understand, I guess, how the United States, the Saudis, and others could have embraced this new leader in Syria as warmly as they did, with the understandings that they had, and yet he seems to have gone back on many of the commitments he made. And the question, I guess, is what do we make of it? What would an American foreign policy look like to take into account this behavior, or do we simply turn a blind eye?
So that's an excellent question. There was a hearing, an HVAC hearing, I guess about 2 weeks ago.
HVAC.
The House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing in Congress focused on Syria. And it was very well attended. It lasted over 3 hours long, this hearing. There was a line of people out the door. I went to attend it in person. So I think that shows there's a lot of interest in Syria in Congress and maybe in DC in general. But I had the sense that people felt a little bit like they were fooled by him, that especially Representative Mast, I think he takes it personally, and that and others, that they, took photographs with Ahmed al-Shara, they shook his hand, we lifted the sanctions from Syria, and now people are starting to question whether he is upholding his commitments. And I think it's, the pattern of violence against ethnic and religious minorities is very chilling and it's very worrying. And when I didn't even talk about the most recent offensive, which just started last month in January, now against the Kurds. So Alawites, Druze, the Christians that were killed in the suicide bombing in the church, and then the offensive against the Northeast, first in Aleppo and then against the Northeast. President Trump publicly did call on the violence to stop. And then CENTCOM Commander Admiral Cooper said also the offensive should stop, but still al-Shara continued the offensive. So I think, there's a lot of questions about what we're going to do now. And I didn't also get to this in my talk, but the Wall Street Journal reported last week that U.S. intelligence assesses, and this is public, in the Wall Street Journal, that between 15,000 to 20,000 Islamic State affiliated people with the Islamic State, some of them militant, some of them women, children, but they were in these camps, that the ISIS detention facilities, that the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, essentially had been protecting since they defeated the caliphate in 2019. Those were suddenly emptied in this chaos as al-Shara attacked the Kurds and they had to withdraw. And so now we have 20,000 ISIS militants on the loose. And this is a little bit concerning. I think that this is a big question mark. What are we going to do now? I don't think anybody has the answer yet.
And what do you think the role of Turkey might be in fomenting this violence against the Kurds?
So we know that in the previous Turkish cross-border interventions in the past, 2016 was the first Turkish cross-border intervention around Al-Bab officially to defeat the Islamic State. There were still some Islamic State militants there, but they also wanted to prevent the Kurds from controlling territory. So then there was a second intervention, 2018 in Afrin, that was clearly going after the Kurds. another intervention 2019, clearly against the Kurds between Ras Al Ain, it's known as Sarakani in Kurdish, or Rish Aino in Aramaic, and Tel Abyad. So clearly Turkey has played a role in targeting the Kurds. And in fact, they trained the former anti-Assad rebels, previously known as the Free Syrian Army. They became, under Turkish patronage, the so-called Syrian National Army, or SNA, and they were really trained not to fight Assad, but to fight the Kurds, to fight the SDF. And so some of my research has looked at that armed conflict data. So there is a concern that, Erdogan is using his influence with al-Sharaa and the new interim government in Damascus to pressure them to take these offensive actions against the SDF and to not make the type of concessions that they might otherwise be willing to make. It's a big question mark, though.
And to go back to my original question then, as to what the U.S. should make of it and what our policy should be, who is the architect of American policy with regard to Syria and Turkey right now?
So I know you know the answer to that question, but the person who is the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, or Türkiye, is also the U.S. special envoy to Syria. So Ambassador Tom Barrack, who is not a career foreign service officer, but has a background in real estate, and he is the one who is working on this file since, I think, May.
So while we're talking about real estate, I think the World Bank has estimated that it will take about $50 billion to reconstruct Syria, something in that range. Who's going to pay for that? What's the talk on the street about where that's going to go?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody knows. And given the reconstruction that will be needed also in Gaza, there's the concern that how will the international community come up with this money? But yeah, the Saudis have committed. They've made some promises in Syria to help with some rebuilding. But if you go, Damascus itself it looks more. I mean, it was more or less spared a large extent from this conflict. But if you just go 10 minutes outside the city of Damascus, there is destruction as far as the eye can see. The whole country. I mean, large parts of the country are destroyed, and people are living in rubble essentially, or in buildings that are not suitable for living. But there are not alternatives at the moment. So.
And then the final question on this general topic is, when Syria, when they overthrew Bashar al-Assad, it was deemed a huge defeat for Russia. Where is Russia now? Are they creeping back in? Has the euphoria about kicking them out ebbed? What's the future of Russia's role here?
So you're absolutely right. The regime of the Assad regime really collapsed in part because Russia, the two main backers of Assad, Russia and Iran, were both distracted by other conflicts. Russia was distracted by the Ukraine conflict, and Iran was distracted after October 7, the conflict with Israel. And so I think that we now see a situation where al-Sharaa continues to try to maintain relations with Russia, however. He has traveled to Moscow. There are still two Russian bases on the coast in Tartus and Latakia. Although in the northeast, the Russians also had a base, and they have reportedly withdrawn from that base in the northeast. But it's pretty clear that al-Sharaa is trying to maintain relations also with Russia, despite the fact that they have Bashar al-Assad. He lives there in Russia.
And they still have the Tartus base.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Giorgio. You mentioned briefly the UAE's venture into Somaliland.
Mhm.
But there's also the Israeli recognition of Somaliland. Why is that important?
Yeah, so on December 26th last year, Israel became the first country in the world to officially recognize Somaliland as an independent country. Somaliland has been a self-declared breakaway republic since the early 1990s. In practice, Somalia's central government in Mogadishu has not had any de facto control over Somaliland for many years, despite the fact that it does exist within Somalia's UN-recognized borders. Very interestingly, right after Israel made this move, there was a very strong response from many Arab and Muslim majority countries denouncing Tel Aviv's decision to recognize Somaliland as independent. Saudi Arabia really led this effort to kind of unite different Arab and Islamic countries in defense of Somalia's territorial dignity. And there were also various multinational institutions, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, African Union, GCC, even the European Union joined in on this to very firmly denounce Israel's move. There are a couple of reasons why Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries feel so threatened by what Israel did. On one hand, I think going back to what I was saying earlier today about the issue of fragmentation, huge concerns in Riyadh that this will set a precedent for separatist groups elsewhere in Africa and the Arab world, and it might embolden these separatist groups and thus exacerbate what Saudi Arabia sees as sort of a crisis of fragmentation in a region that has many fragile states already. Then also bringing us back to what I was mentioning, the September 9 Israeli attack on Doha. That was an event that did a lot to really inform threat perceptions of Israel on the part of not only Qatar, but also other GCC states. And so the concern...
GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council.
Sorry. Yes, Gulf Cooperation Council. Yes, I apologize. I use acronyms all the time, and I will do my best to spell out the acronyms. There are concerns that Israel's diplomatic recognition of Somaliland is going to be much more than a symbolic development. There are reports that the Israelis are going to set up a military presence in this breakaway republic, and this terrifies the countries in the GCC that worry that it could make it easier for Israel to attack countries in the Gulf. And also, although not a Gulf Cooperation Council member, there is Yemen, which is in extremely close geographic proximity to Somaliland. The Saudis are concerned that Israel will intensify attacks against the Houthis from this part of Somalia and thus exacerbate Red Sea security problems. So basically, the view from Riyadh and many other Arab capitals is that Israel's encroachment into this part of Somalia is going to be a driver of instability at a time when Saudi Arabia believes that there is already enough instability in the greater Horn of Africa region with everything that's going on in Sudan, and then also everything going on in Yemen and events in the Red Sea since October 7th. This does factor into the tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. While the UAE has not joined Israel in formally recognizing Somaliland as an independent country, for many years the UAE has made huge investments in Somaliland, disregarding the sovereignty of the central government in Mogadishu. And reports are that the UAE encouraged Israel to recognize Somaliland's independence late last year. So from Riyadh's perspective, the UAE-Israel axis of fragmentation is very much at work in Somalia, trying to carve up that nation state. And we saw earlier this year, Saudi Arabia signed a defense an MOU in the defense sector.
MOU?
Oh, Memorandum of Understanding. Right. I'm sorry. Yes, they signed a Memorandum of Understanding to bolster Saudi military support for Mogadishu. And this is definitely Riyadh's way of trying to signal that any efforts to carve up the Somali nation state will be met with regional actors, including Qatar, Egypt, which had its own defense agreement signed with Mogadishu in 2024, and also Turkey coming to Mogadishu's defense. In short, I think the Somaliland issue is going to be more of a flashpoint and a fault line in these tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE moving forward.
So to illustrate the significance and synthesize some of what you just said, if you look up here, talked about the UAE, and they are developing ports along both sides of the Red Sea. You've got Israel recognizing Somaliland, and they all have a, thank you, a gating element right here called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And what happened? What's going on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait?
Well, this is what much of the trade between Asia and Europe depends upon. I don't remember the exact percentage, but a massive amount of global trade goes through this extremely narrow waterway, which has been vulnerable to Houthi maritime attacks since October 7th, 2023. The Houthis have paused them since the fall of last year, but global trade is obviously very vulnerable to any type of instability in or near this strait.
Okay, terrific. Well, let's open it up for questions now. Feel free, lady back here in the back. We have a microphone for you coming to you.
Thank you. I would like to hear opinion of both panelists. We are talking about dictatorship, brutality of the ways when it comes to a lot of countries in the Middle East, forgetting that when we look at each one of these countries, they're multi-ethnic, multi-religion groups. And the reason for it is because Brits and France at some point decided to take a ruler and carve up Ottoman lands, right? So how can we envision or maybe, suggest to leaders of those countries how to control such a very volatile region and not resort to, harsh methods? Because each one of these groups has very conflicting agenda with another. So the only reason that all of those countries survived until today was the dictatorship. And now the new government of Syria is trying to achieve just that. And the reason that Somalia is failing because they don't have a strength to do that. So these are two examples that pretty much proves their point that the only way to control it is by force. So what do we do about it? Because we're sitting in our very nicely democratic country looking at it across the ocean and saying that they should be more democratic. And those forces that Kurdish had, they announced themselves to be democratic, but it's not like they had elections to actually claim that title, right? Thank you.
You want to get maybe a few questions at once, or should we do it?
Right now, we can just take that one jointly if you wish. Yeah.
So I'll start and then. So I think that that's an excellent question. The Kurds in northeast Syria actually were planning. They did have elections, I believe, in 2017, and they were planning to have elections again in the summer of 2024. They wanted to have elections for mayors in the region of the country they controlled, that 1/3 in the northeast. And who was opposed to that? Erdogan said if they hold elections, it will be a national security threat to Turkey. Just holding elections. And the US State Department then discouraged them from holding elections. Now, you could say the conditions were not ideal. The country, again, was divided. You still had Assad in control in Damascus, you had the Turkish occupied areas, etc. But they wanted to hold elections and they were discouraged from doing so. So, but I think your bigger question is that I think a solution is some form of decentralization, which effectively has already been in existence for the past decade or more in Syria because the country was fragmented. And the Middle East has, if you compare the Middle East to other regions of the world, it has the lowest levels of democratization. It also has the lowest levels of decentralization. Most of the region are highly centralized regimes, as you said. It does not mean that decentralization will automatically lead to democracy, but it would allow local people more control over their own affairs. For example, we have states' rights here in the United States, right? The European Union encourages many countries in the European Union to decentralize because they found that is associated with higher levels of fiscal responsibility. So budgets are more likely to be responsibly controlled if you have more local control as opposed to a centrally controlled budget. So my point is that, that's what not just the Kurds, but also now the Druze in the south, they want some form of local autonomy, meaning control of their own security apparatus and perhaps their own education system if they want to teach different languages, Kurdish, Aramaic, in addition to Arabic. And that is what I think would be a way forward that would, maintain the unity of Syria as a sovereign state, but to allow some level of decentralization within it.
Giorgio, any comment?
I think Amy gave a great response. It would be tough for me to follow up on that. So I think
Okay.
we'll stick with Amy's response.
Next question right here. Yes, sir.
Maybe I wanted to follow up on your last article that you brought up, but we did not follow the Kurds could have been a partner in rebuilding Syria with Shara and why Shara attacked them. And in relation to that, I wanted to also bring the question of what is happening, kind of a dehumanization of the Kurds in Arab media, especially. If you read the Arab social media and, the Kurdish administration of Iraq banned Arab media, big media from their areas, you will think that the Kurds were the one who defeated the Arab side in 48, 73, and 67 combined. And what do you think is the relationship between this kind of Shara, the Arab opinion against the Kurds, and the attack on the Kurds and the support that it's receiving?
So you're right. I didn't get a chance to talk about some of the hate speech that we've seen over the past year. Hate speech and disinformation. And I talk about that a little bit in that article that I put up there that I published with the Atlantic Council. When al-Sharaa launched this offensive against Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo, the Sheikh Maksud and Ashrafiyah neighborhoods, one of the terrible incidents that happened is that the body of, again, and part of the Aleppo agreement was that the Kurdish police forces would be allowed to have local security in those neighborhoods of Aleppo, right? That's what they agreed with the government part of Aleppo. And this Aleppo agreement was proof that decentralization can work in practice, because actually the Kurds and the interim government had agreed that they could have police in their own local neighborhoods. One of the women that was part of that police force, her body was thrown out of a high floor of a building in Aleppo during this offensive, which, has been verified. And there were men chanting, Allahu Akbar, as this woman's body was thrown out of the building. And so they were celebrating this. It's just one example. Another example is that when the offensive continued into the northeast in Hasaka, a member of the security forces in Damascus filmed himself and, desecrating cemeteries of the Syrian Democratic Forces, calling them pigs. Now, although the Syrian Democratic Forces actually became Arab majority as it got bigger and bigger over time and they defeated the Islamic State, but you're right, there's so much disinformation about Syria, and I do partly blame some of the regional media that has contributed to this. I think that, and because Syria was fragmented, it's almost as if Syrians were living in 4 different realities for the past 14 or 15 years, because people in Damascus wouldn't travel to the northeast and vice versa. And now they can, in theory, travel, but this media ecosystem that, spreads disinformation and hate speech, it's a huge problem. And I hope there will be, there are some local initiatives that are like Verify Syria that try to verify certain things that spread online on social media. But I do hope there will be some accountability for these really terrible examples that I just provided. So
Let's take a question for Giorgio. Over here? Yes, in the back. Tessa.
Thank you. From the Saudi perspective, what are the most important considerations or necessary factors for them to see stability in the Middle East for them to be able to prosper? Like,
I think, yeah, I think that in this period, Saudi Arabia believes that Israel's conduct in the region is the number one threat to regional stability. If we were having this discussion, 10, 15 years ago, it would have definitely been hands down Iran as the number one driver of instability. I think Saudi Arabia right now sees Iran and the greater axis of resistance as much weaker and thus less of still a threat, but less of a threat. And I think the unconditional support that Washington has given Israel in the post-October 7th period has encouraged Israel to engage in certain conduct in the region that Saudi Arabia believes to be very destabilizing. And this is one of Saudi Arabia's, the Saudi leadership's main goals is to convince the Trump administration that it needs to use Washington's leverage to rein in Israel.
Other questions over here? Yes, thank you.
But this is an excellent panel. This whole day has been phenomenal. Should be required for every high school in America. But you have commented on on the danger that Israel presents to the Arab world in the Middle East, and yet the only defender of the Druze in Syria has been Israel. They're the ones that protected them. So my question is, can you comment on the Islamic introspection? For 1400 years, Sunni has killed Shia, Shia have killed Sunni, killed Alawites. The infidel is forget about it. Can you comment on any introspection as part of the Islamic world as to the cause of this incredible instability for 1400 years?
Who wants it? Giorgio.
I don't know if you'll want me speaking to high school students by the end of this panel. I just want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking if in Muslim countries there is introspection about mistreatment of non-Muslim minorities?
And infidels. It's all the same. Attacked another Muslim country, Iran. Turkey is now not protecting Kurds who have been protecting others that live in Kurdish areas. It doesn't make sense from a Western perspective and the democratic with a little small d. We're all equal under the law. We have the First Amendment. The government does not make rules on religion, for or against or none.
I'm going to very respectfully challenge a little bit of the premise of this question here, and I welcome many other people's opinions about this too. I believe today in the Middle East, most of the conflict in fighting certainly has religious dimensions, and there are fanatics of more than one religion in the region that certainly exploit religious bigotry and tension. But speaking very broadly here, I think the root causes of violence in the Middle East tend to have to do with political issues, not so much religion. And there's obviously a lot more to build on that, but I think that would be something important to think about.
Okay, next question. Yes, ma'am, back here in the blue.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk about Syria. I'm Ghada Muqdad, the Syrian peace activist, and very glad that you are interested in our country. But there is so much of bias regarding our country. First, we want to give a chance for this government, for transitional government, for Ahmed al-Shara. We want to give him a chance because he is doing great. If you look on the ground, what's going on inside Syria. I have been there. I witnessed the liberation, and then last September, I spent like 3 months back in Syria. The media work just to destabilize Syria. If you go there, you will not find all your report, what you are talking about Kurd. I was living in Kamishli, very close to the airport. You cannot imagine what the Syrian Democratic Party has done to Syria. They prevent me from going to my home. They do nothing. They spend all their time just doing the tunnel. They did not spend $1 on the city. They prevent, they recruit girls, they recruit children. And I cannot imagine that we cannot give a chance to al-Shara because he's following exactly what the United Nations wants from him. I blame him that now he's depending very much on his closest circle, which is not good. But as long as he's building the state from scratch, we need to give him a chance to build Syria again. Besides, I have other opinion that even Druze in the south, it doesn't mean that they have to build a state for them. Alawiyat in the coast, it doesn't mean that they have to build their new state there. Syria for all Syrians. We were coexistent. We are living with each other. My neighbors, she's a Christian. My other neighbor, she's Kurd. I believe in that coexistence. Syria has been a long history of coexistence. So we want to be positive and support Syrian leaders right now. Besides, I'm against them now that there's there's no participation for women. So we want to reach at least 30% for that. But we want to encourage him and to give a chance for our country and for our leaders. Thank you so much for giving me the time. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit sick. But I'm very glad that I can come today here.
Thank you. Just briefly.
So
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for your comments, and happy to speak to you afterwards. I think we're almost at the end of our panel. You're right. The point is not that the different minorities should establish their own state, but on the contrary, that Syria as a unified country could have within a unified sovereign Syria some forms of decentralization. For example, that different governorates would be allowed to nominate or elect their own governor. That was one of the agreements that the concessions that was made in the January 30 agreement between the SDF and Damascus. Yes, exactly. Right. And right. And in the Druze in Sweden had also requested to nominate a woman governor to be the representative of Sweden after the fall of the regime, and that was refused by Damascus. But now they've agreed that in Hasaka they could nominate a governor for Hasaka, so perhaps that could set a precedent for other governorates in Syria so that you could have some sort of locally nominated governors, just as one example. And the issue of child recruitment has been a problem across all of the rebel groups in Syria. The SDF did sign an agreement to end child recruitment, I believe, in 2019. But you're right, it's a problem that has plagued the conflict. So thank you.
We've got time for one more question, very quick question, if anyone in the room has one. Yes, sir.
Somebody being recognized by Israel. I'm not so sure, but I heard a rumor, or I read that somewhere, that Israel is looking for territories to move the Palestinians out of Gaza, give them a place to go and live. Is there any truth or anything that you've thought along those lines?
Yes, the gentleman was asking if there's some truth to these reports about an Israeli plan to relocate Palestinians to this part of Somalia, Somaliland. It's a good question. So indeed, there was talk about this. My understanding is that the authorities in Somalia and Somaliland stated that this will not happen. Of course, time will tell. It's certainly a really important issue to for all of us to keep on looking at. But my understanding is that this is not confirmed, and at this point is really mainly hearsay.
Many thanks to our panel. It's been a wonderful discussion, and thanks for great questions. Thank you, guys.